Hello everyone and welcome to a long overdue video with me, Disney Lorcana. Yeah, that's right, it is a bit overdue, isn't it? I have been away for a little while. It's mainly due to personal issues, sometimes they just get in the way. But regardless, I am back now and ready to talk about the DLC Seattle that just happened, and also catch up with how we've been doing with our set champs. I was able to snag myself a Mirabelle champion mat along with a playset of Mirabelles in total. And in fact, you can actually catch my semi-final and final matches that led to me winning that champion mat on the Casually Trying Hard channel, which I'll link down below. But now that we're all somewhat caught up, let's take a look at the DLC Seattle results. And so what I first wanted to take a look at was the overall meta game of the tournament. So here you can see a breakdown of day one. So the overall meta game of the entire weekend, if you like. Of course, we still see Ruby Sapphire dominating at the top of the list. It's just still such a strong and consistent deck, but it's closely followed by Emerald Steel, which of course had a rise to fame after Zansayed's victory over at DLC Vegas. The Ruby Amethyst faithful are still putting in a good shift, along with the Steelsong troop. Oh, actually, I can't forget Steel Fassa as well. They are also turning up to support the Amber Steel squad. But a couple of interesting things that I'd like to point out. Ruby Amethyst's conversion rate from their total players to the top cut is actually really strong, with a 4.3% conversion rate. Actually, the second highest over the biggest shock, which is Sapphire Steel, where although they only had 6% of the players at Seattle, 4.41% of those actually made it to the top cut, the highest percentage out of all combinations. I mean, if you're able to dodge a lot of the red-blue and come up against the green-steel, where it's quite possible to win if you can get a Cogsworth down and protect your board with resist, then you're laughing, really. So I'm not really surprised that so many made it to the top cut. However, although 5 players did make it to the top cut with Sapphire Steel, none of them actually progressed past the top 64, further showing that the deck's still just not in the greatest place at the moment. And speaking of the top 64, let's then have a look at the day 2 metagame. One thing I do think is kind of crazy is that Amethyst Emerald had 2 players in the top 64, but didn't even make it into the top 9 colour combinations that were represented at Seattle, further proving that the deck is still really strong, just for some reason a lot of players have moved on from it. So now let's move on to having a look at some of the top decks from the top colour combinations at the event. The winner of DLC Seattle was Luke Goodwin, and he was playing on an Emerald Steel discard deck. Luke's opted to put a copy of Doc in, which when you play him, you can discard your hand to draw 2 cards. On an empty hand, this is basically just draw 2 cards. Situational, sure, but that's why he's only a 1 copy of. Not to mention, you can bounce him back with the Muses and replay him to draw 2 cards again. Speaking of the Muses, an extra copy has been added to this version of the deck, and I noticed that to be a trend across a few of the Emerald Steel decks over the weekend. Muses are exceptionally good against aggro, as well as replaying some of your own characters. Being able to play a Ursula Deceiver on repeat against Mirror Match Green Steel or Steelsong is very useful indeed. The card that made way for Doc seems to be a copy of Anna, and I don't know about this. I really love this card, and in all honesty, I've never really had much of a problem with drawing with this deck, so I'm not sure I could quite reduce her down to 1 copy. She's come in clutch in a lot of games for me, so I think I'd keep her at 2 personally. Luke's also opted to drop a copy of Hypnotize and We Don't Talk About Bruno, and add a couple of Baboons in, likely to deal with the Mirror Match Diablos or early threats such as the Cinderella 1-drop from Steelsong, or even being able to stop early shifts such as the Queen if you're on the play, or Robin Hood in any case. Moving on to the deck that took second place, and that was a Steelsong deck that was run by Sean Long. Sean's opted for the much more aggressive Daisy Duck Queen Shift version of Steelsong, as well as including a couple of Blue just to seal out a game. I actually really like Blue. He poses as a threat when he enters the board. Your opponent doesn't really want to give you 2 lore, but not only that, he can still attack despite the fact he has 0 attack, so you can just run him into something, blow him up to gain 2 lore, if it was going to win you the game. Interesting to see that Sean's also opted for a couple of copies of Gaston, the Baritone Bully. Sometimes that extra point of strength is all you need to keep a character on the board for longer. And being able to play Gaston on turn 3, and then play an Ariel on the next turn to find the song that you want to sing with him, is actually quite good, and lessens the scenario where you would play an Ariel usually and then it just gets brawl before you can play the song. In third place was a Ruby Amethyst deck run by Michael Majors. My goodness, does this variant have a lot of draw power, which is a fantastic choice given the amount of green steel that they'd be running into. Cards such as Finders Keepers that let you draw 3 cards for 5 ink are just perfect against these kind of matchups. Not to mention that they run Friends on the Other Side, Rabbits, Brooms, Chernobog, Cusco. Oh, and if you're wanting to draw even more cards, you could then put all of these into the library or even a Queen's Castle, and they'll make you draw even more cards. Did I mention this deck likes cards? There's a reason that this deck has been the most consistent deck over the past few sets. The amount of cards that you can draw just allows you to have all the options you need to fight against what's on the board at the time. The only thing I don't know if I'm quite in agreement with this version of the deck is that there is just a singular copy of Elsa, the Fifth Spirit. This card is fantastic at taking out multiple Diablos and can even be used in combination with Merlin Crab to create a terrifying 5/5 rush evasive. And now let's take a look at the top Ruby Sapphire deck, and this was piloted by Jacob Schmidt. And there's a couple of things that stick out to me in this deck. It's quite different to the ones I usually see. Firstly, there's no T-pose. It is Chicha that they've opted for instead, assumedly going for a line like turn 1 Porpsicle, turn 2 Chicha, turn 3 Fishbone Quill, double ink, draw a card from Chicha. Certainly something that this deck suffered from previously was if you didn't hit Hiram, your card draw options were very, very limited. And so bringing Chicha in as an alternate form of card draw is probably a good shout. Overall though, what I notice is this deck is built to deal with some more aggressive decks. 3 copies of Queen of Hearts Impulsive Ruler will be fantastic for taking out early threats. A grand total of 3 copies of Scar Vicious Cheetah is also fantastic into decks that maybe have high willpower, low strength characters. In fact, they've actually opted to take out every copy of Maui in favour of Scar. It's a bold decision, as Maui's always been a staple in Ruby, but I quite like it. Scar boasts the same stat line, and although he does cost 2 more, is able to take out multiple things in one turn, really giving that element of surprise to the opponent. Greatstone Dragon is a card that I've come to hate as an Emerald Steel discard player, but is fantastic for the red-blue players. Let's put it this way, whether you're playing against Emerald Steel discard or Amber Steelsong, you're going to have cards put into your discard, whether it's by Whole New World or any of the discard packages in Emerald Steel. Greatstone Dragon means that the characters discarded from that are not useless. It can just be used for ink. And what's better is that's not a card taken out of your hand, it's taken out of your discard. So you're not losing a card when inking. Yeah, I'm a big fan of this card, massively. It also means that anything that you use to trade into things can then just be recycled for ink as well. Now I know that Emerald Amethyst wasn't exactly highly represented overall at the tournament, but we know how good this deck is, so let's take a look at the one that came 6th overall at the tournament. I also just wanted an excuse to talk about this deck by Sean Keaton. It's very, very interesting. 4 copies of what might just be my favourite card in the game, Beast Relentless, a character that whenever an opposing character is damaged can be readied. It's just a fantastic card to combo and win the game with. I've made countless green steel decks trying this character out, and they're some of the decks that I've had the most fun with. But that's not all. In combination with the Mystical Rose, which can be banished to give the beast an extra 2 lore this turn, it means that every time he quests that turn he's questing for 4. So really all you need to do is do damage with one other character and he's questing for 8, and so on and so forth. It's absolutely crazy when you think about it. Outside of that, most of the deck is what we're used to seeing from Emerald Amethyst, with a couple of Peter Pan Shadow Finders chucked in to deal with those pesky Diablos, and some Pinocchios to provide some exerting power so that we can get that combo with Beast off. Although I'm an Emerald Steel man through and through, this deck is probably the closest one to tempting me to move to a different colour set. And lastly, let's take a look at the top Steel Sapphire deck, a deck that really overperformed in terms of its overall performance over the weekend. But as I say, unfortunately just missed out on making the top 32. And looking at this deck by Yam Moy, it's very similar to what we expect to see from Sapphire Steel at this point. I'd argue that its performance being better at the moment is simply because we're seeing more Emerald Steel, and cards such as Cogsworth Elspeth Grandfather Clock really shut that deck down, along with Aerial Treasure Collector, which they just can't touch. And Aerial Treasure Collector also poses a problem for Ruby Sapphire as well. They just can't touch this card at all without a Be Prepared. And it quests for 5 each turn, and with a lucky dime, you're gaining 10. It's crazy numbers. And that's everything I wanted to take a look at from the weekend. I hope you find this video useful. There's still some big tournaments in between now and when Set 6 As You Right See is released. So perhaps some of these decks will provide some inspiration for your next deck. But that's it for now, so as always, I've been Hazmat Lorcana, you've been you guys, and I'll see you in the next one, which I promise won't take as long as it's taken for this one to come out. Bye for now!